This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G. Chesterton. Section 25, Chapter 13, Is the Atlantic Narrowing? A certain kind of question is asked very earnestly in our time because of a certain logical quality in it. Connected with the premises and data, it is very difficult to answer. Thus people will ask, what is the hidden weakness in the Celtic race that makes them everywhere fail or fade away? Or how the Germans contrived to bring all their organization into a state of such perfect efficiency? And what was the significance of the recent victory of Prussia? Or they will ask by what stages the modern world has abandoned all belief in miracles, and the modern newspapers ceased to print any news of murders. They will ask why English politics are free from corruption, or by what mental and moral training certain millionaires were enabled to succeed by sheer force of character. In short, they will ask why plutocrats govern well, and how it is that pigs fly, spreading their pink pinions to the breeze, or delighting us as they twitter and flutter from tree to tree. The logical difficulty of answering these questions is connected with an old story about Charles II and a bowl of goldfish, and with another anecdote about a gentleman who was asked, "When did you leave off beating your wife?" But there is something analogous to it in the present discussions about the forces drawing England and America together. It seems as if the reasoners hardly went far enough back in their argument, or took trouble enough to disentangle their assumptions. They are still moving with the momentum of the peculiar 19th century notion of progress, of certain very simple tendencies perpetually increasing and needing no special analysis. It is so with the international rapprochement I have to consider here. In other places I have ventured to express a doubt about whether nations can be drawn together by an ancient rumour about races, by a sort of prehistoric chit-chat, or the gossip of the Stone Age. I have ventured further, and even expressed a doubt about whether they ought to be drawn together, or rather dragged together, by the brute violence of the engines of science and speed. But there is yet another horrible doubt haunting my morbid mind, which will be better for my constitution to confess frankly. And that is the doubt about whether they are being drawn together at all. It has long been a conversational commonplace among the enlightened that all countries are coming closer and closer to each other. It was a conversational commonplace among the enlightened somewhere about the year 1913 that all wars were receding farther and farther into a barbaric past. There is something about these sayings that seems simple and familiar and entirely satisfactory when we say them. They are of that consoling sort which we can say without any of the mental pain of thinking what we are saying. But if we turn our attention from the phrases we use to the facts that we talk about, we shall realize at least that there are a good many facts on the other side, and examples pointing the other way. For instance, it does happen occasionally, from time to time, that people talk about Ireland. He would be a very hilarious humanitarian who should maintain that Ireland and England have been more and more assimilated during the last 100 years. The very name of Sinn Féin is an answer to it, and the very language in which that phrase is spoken. Curran and Shiel would no more have dreamed of uttering the watchword of repeal in Gaelic than of uttering it in Zulu. Grattan could hardly have brought himself to believe that the real repeal of the Union would actually be signed in London in the strange script as remote as the snaky ornament of the Celtic crosses. It would have seemed like Washington signing the Declaration of Independence in the picture writing of the Red Indians. Ireland has clearly grown away from England, and her language, literature, and type of patriotism are far less English than they were. On the other hand, no one will pretend that the masses of modern Englishmen are much nearer to talking Gaelic or decorating Celtic crosses. 100 years ago it was perfectly natural that Byron and Moore should walk down the street arm in arm. Even the sight of Mr. Rudyard Kipling and Mr. W.B. Yeats walking down the street arm in arm would now arouse some remark. I could give any number of other examples of the same new estrangement of nations. I could cite the obvious facts that Norway and Sweden parted company not very long ago, that Austria and Hungary have again become separate states. I could point to the mob of new nations that have started up after the war, to the fact that the great empires are now nearly all broken up, that the Russian Empire no longer directs Poland, that the Austrian Empire no longer directs Bohemia, that the Turkish Empire no longer directs Palestine. Sinn Féin is the separatism of the Irish. Zionism is the separatism of the Jews. But there is one simple and sufficing example which is here more to my purpose, and is at least equally sufficient for it, and that is the deepening national difference between the Americans and the English. Let me test it first by my individual experience in the matter of literature. When I was a boy I read a book like The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table exactly as I read another book like The Book of Snobs. I did not think of it as an American book, but simply as a book. Its wit and idiom were like those of the English literary tradition, and its few touches of local colour seemed merely accidental, like those of an Englishman who happened to be living in Switzerland or Sweden. My father and my father's friends were rightly enthusiastic for the book, so that it seemed to come to me by inheritance like Gulliver's Travels or Tristram Shandy. Its language was as English as Ruskin, and a great deal more English than Carlyle. Well, I have seen in later years an almost equally wide and well-merited popularity of the stories of O. Henry, but never for one moment could I or anyone else reading them forget that they were stories by an American about America. The very first fact about them is that they are told with an American accent, that is, in the unmistakable tones of a brilliant and fascinating foreigner. And the same is true of every other recent work of which the fame has managed to cross the Atlantic. We did not say that the Spoon River Anthology was a new book, but that it was a new book from America. It was exactly as if a remarkable realistic novel was reported from Russia or Italy. We were in no danger of confusing it with the Elegy in a Country Churchyard. People in England who heard of Main Street were not likely to identify it with High Street, with the principal thoroughfare in any little town in Berkshire or Buckinghamshire. But when I was a little boy I practically identified the boarding house of the Autocrat with any boarding house I happened to know in Brompton or Brighton. No doubt there were differences, but the point is that the differences did not pierce the consciousness or prick the illusion. I said to myself, people are like this in boarding houses, not people are like this in Boston. This can be seen even in the simple matter of language, especially in the sense of slang. Take, for instance, the delightful sketch in The Causerie of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the character of the young man called John. He is the very modern type of every modern country who does specialize in slang. He is the young fellow who is something in the city, the everyday young man of the Gilbertian song, with a stick and a pipe and a half-bred black and tan. In every country he is at once witty and commonplace. In every country, therefore, he tends both to the vivacity and the vulgarity of slang. But when he appeared in Holmes' book, his language was not very different from what it would have been in a Brighton instead of Boston boarding house. Or, in short, if the young man called John had more commonly been called 'Arry, if he had appeared in a modern American book, his language would have been almost literally unintelligible. At the least, an Englishman would have had to read some of the best sentences twice, as he sometimes has to read the dizzy and involved metaphors of O. Henry. Nor is it an answer that this depended on the personalities of the particular writers. A comparison between the real journalism of the time of Holmes and the real journalism of the time of Henry reveals the same thing. It is the expansion of a slight difference of style into a luxuriant difference of idiom. And the process, continued indefinitely, would certainly produce a totally different language. After a few centuries, the signatures of American ambassadors would look as fantastic as Gaelic, and the very name of the Republic be as strange as Sinn Fein. It is true that there has been on the surface a certain amount of give and take, or at least, as far as the English are concerned, of take rather than give. But it is true that it was once all the other way. And indeed the one thing is something just like a nemesis of the other. Indeed the story of the reversal is somewhat singular, when we come to think of it. It began in a certain atmosphere and spirit of certain well-meaning people who talked about the English-speaking race and were apparently indifferent to how the English was spoken, whether in the accent of a Jamaican negro or a convict from Botany Bay. It was their logical tendency to say that Dante was a Dago. It was their logical punishment to say that Disraeli was an Englishman. Now, there may have been a period when this Anglo-American amalgamation included more or less equal elements from England and America. It never included the larger elements or the more valuable elements of either. But on the whole, I think it is true to say that it was not an allotment, but an interchange of parts, and that things went all one way and then all the other way. People began by telling the Americans that they owed all their past triumphs to England, which was false. They ended up by telling the English that they would owe all their future triumphs to America, which is, if possible, still more false. Because we chose to forget that New York had been New Amsterdam, we are now in danger of forgetting that London is not New York. Because we insisted that Chicago was only a pious imitation of Chiswick, we may yet see Chiswick an inferior imitation of Chicago. Our Anglo-Saxon historians attempted that conquest in which Howe and Burgoyne had failed, and with infinitely less justification on their side. They attempted the great crime of the Anglicisation of America. They have called down the punishment of the Americanization of England. We must not murmur, but it is a heavy punishment. It may lift a little of its load, however, if we look at it more closely. We shall then find that, though it is very much on top of us, it is only on top, in the sense that such Americanization as there is very superficial. For instance, there is a certain amount of American slang picked up at random. It appears in certain pushing types of journalism and drama. But we may easily dwell too much on this tragedy of people who have never spoken English beginning to speak American. I am far from suggesting that American, like any other foreign language, may not frequently contribute to the common culture of the world phrases for which there is no substitute. There are French phrases so used in England, and English phrases in France. The word highbrow, for instance, is a real discovery and a revelation, a new and necessary name for something that walked nameless but enormous in the modern world. A shaft of light and a stroke of lightning. That comes from America, and belongs to the world as much as The Raven or The Scarlet Letter or the novels of Henry James belong to the world. In fact, I can imagine Henry James originating it in the throes of self-expression, and bringing out a word like highbrowed with a sort of gentle jerk, at the end of searching sentences which groped sensitively until they found the phrase. But most of the American slang that is borrowed seems to be borrowed for no particular reason. It either has no point, or the point is lost by translation into another context and culture. It is either something which does not need any grotesque and exaggerative description, or of which there already exists a grotesque and exaggerative description more native to our tongue and soil. For instance, I cannot see that the strong and simple expression, "Now it is for you to pull the police magistrate's nose," in any way strengthened by saying, "Now it is up to you to pull the police magistrate's nose." When Tennyson says of the men of the Light Brigade, "Theirs but to do and die," the expression seems to me perfectly lucid. Up to them to do and die would alter the metre without especially clarifying the meaning. This is an example of ordinary language being quite adequate. But there is a further difficulty, that even wild slang comes to sound like ordinary language. Very often the English have already as humorous and fanciful idiom of their own, only that through habit it has lost its humour. When Keats wrote the line, "What pipes and timbrels, what wild ecstasy," I am willing to believe that the American humorist would have expressed the same sentiment by beginning the sentence with "some pipe." When that was first somewhere in the wilds of Colorado, it was really funny, involving a powerful understatement and the suggestion of a mere sample. If a spinster has informed us that she keeps a bird, and we find it is an ostrich, there will be considerable point in the Colorado satirist saying inquiringly, "Some bird," as if he were offering us a small slice of a small plover. But if we go back to this root and rationale of a joke, the English language already contains quite as good a joke. It is not necessary to say "some bird." There is a far finer irony in the old expression "something like a bird." It suggests that the speaker sees something faintly and strangely bird-like about a bird, that is remotely and almost irrationally reminds him of a bird, and that there is about ostrich plumes a yard long something like the faint and delicate traces of a feather. It has every quality of imaginative irony, except that nobody even imagines it to be ironical. All that happens is that people get tired of that turn of phrase, take up a foreign phrase and get tired of that, without realizing the point of either. All that happens is that a number of weary people who used to say "something like a bird" now say "some bird," with undiminished weariness. But they might just as well use dull and decent English, for in both cases they are only using jocular language without seeing the joke. There is indeed a considerable trade in the transplantation of these American jokes to England just now. They generally pine and die in our climate, or they are dead before their arrival. But we cannot be certain that they were never alive. There is a sort of unending frieze or scroll of decorative designs unrolled ceaselessly before the British public about a hen-pecked husband, which is indistinguishable to the eye from an actual self-repeating pattern like that of the Greek key, but which is imported as if it were precious and irreplaceable as the Elgin marbles. Advertisement and syndication make mountains out of the most funny little molehills, but no doubt the molehills are picturesque enough in their own landscape. In any case, there is nothing so national as humour, and many things, like many people, can be humorous enough when they are at home. But these American jokes are boomed as solemnly as American religions, and their supporters gravely testify that they are funny, without seeing the fun of it for a moment. This is partly, perhaps, the spirit of spontaneous institutionalism in American democracy, breaking out in the wrong place. They make humour an institution, and a man will be set to tell an anecdote as if to play the violin. But when the story is told in America, it really is amusing, and when these jokes are reprinted in England, they are often not even intelligible. With all the stupidity of the millionaire and the monopolist, the enterprising proprietor prints jokes in England which are necessarily unintelligible to nearly every English person, jokes referring to domestic and local conditions quite peculiar to America. I saw one of these native caricatures the other day, in which the whole of the joke, what there was of it, turned on the astonishment of a housewife at the absurd notion of not having an ice-box. It is perfectly true that nearly every ordinary American housewife possesses an ice-box. An ordinary English housewife would no more expect to possess an ice-box than to possess an iceberg, and it would be about as sensible to tow an iceberg to an English port all the way from the North Pole as to trail that one pale and frigid joke to Fleet Street all the way from the New York papers. It is the same with 100 other advertisements and adaptations. I have already confessed that I took considerable delight in the dancing illuminations of Broadway while in Broadway. Everything there is suitable to them. The vast interminable thoroughfare, the topping houses, the dizzy and restless spirit of the whole city. It is a city of dissolving views, and one may almost say a city in everlasting dissolution. But I do not especially admire a burning fragment of Broadway stuck up opposite the old Georgian curve of Regent Street. I would as soon express sympathy with the Republic of Switzerland by erecting a small Alp with imitation snow in the middle of St. James's Park. But all this commercial copying is very superficial, and above all it never copies anything that is really worth copying. Nations never learn anything from each other in this way. We have many things to learn from America, but we only listen to those Americans who have still to learn them. Thus, for instance, we do not import the small farm, but only the big shop. In other words, we hear nothing of the democracy of the Middle West, but everything of the plutocracy of the middle man, who is probably as unpopular in the Middle West as the miller in the Middle Ages. If Mr. Elihu K. Pike could be transplanted bodily from the neighborhood of his home town of Marathon, Nebraska, with his farm and his frame house and all its fittings, and they could be set down exactly in the spot now occupied by Selfridges, which could be easily cleared away for the purpose, I think we could really get a great deal of good by watching him, even if the watching were inevitably a little too like watching a wild beast in a cage or an insect under a glass case. Urban crowds could collect every day behind a barrier or railing and gaze at Mr. Pike pottering about all day in his ancient and out of Chthonia's occupations. We could see him growing Indian corn with all the gravity of an Indian, though it is impossible to imagine Mrs. Pike blessing the cornfield in the manner of Minnehaha. As I have said, there is a certain lack of humane myth and mysticism about this Puritan peasantry. But we could see him transforming the maize into popcorn, which is a very pleasant domestic ritual and pastime, and is the American equivalent of the glory of roasting chestnuts. Above all, many of us would learn for the first time that a man can really live and walk about upon something more productive than a pavement, and that when he does so he can really be a free man and have no lord but the law. Instead of that, America can give nothing to London but those multiple modern shops of which it has too many already. I know that many people entertain the innocent illusion that big shops are more efficient than small ones, but that is only because the big combinations have the monopoly of advertisement as well as of trade. The big shop is not in the least remarkable for efficiency. It is only too big to be blamed for its inefficiency. It is secured in its reputation for always sacking the wrong man. A big shop, considered as a place to shop, is simply a village of small shops roofed in to keep out the light and air, and one in which none of the shopkeepers is really responsible for his shop. If anyone has any doubts on this matter, since I have mentioned it, let him consider this fact, that in practice we never do apply this method of commercial combination to anything that matters very much. We do not go to the surgical department of the stores to have a portion of our brain removed by a delicate operation, and then pass on to the advocacy department to employ one or any of its barristers when we are in temporary danger of being hanged. We go to men who own their own tools and are responsible for the use of their own talents. And the same truth applies to that other modern method of advertisement, which has also so largely fallen across us like the gigantic shadow of America. Nations do not arm themselves for a mortal struggle by remembering which sort of submarine they have seen most often on the hoardings. They can do it about something like soap, precisely because a nation will not perish by having a second-rate sort of soap, as it might by having a second-rate sort of submarine. A nation may indeed perish slowly by having a second-rate sort of food or drink or medicine, but that is another and much longer story. And the story is not ended yet. But nobody wins a great battle at a great crisis because somebody has told him that Cadgerboy's cavalry is the best. It may be that commercial enterprise will eventually cover these fields also, and advertisement agents will provide the instruments of the surgeon and the weapons of the soldier. When that happens, the armies will be defeated and the patients will die. But though we modern people are indeed patients, in the sense of being merely receptive and accepting things with astonishing patience, we are not dead yet, and we have lingering gleams of sanity. For the best things do not travel. As I appear here as a traveller, I may say with all modesty that the best people do not travel either. Both in England and America, the normal people are the national people, and I repeat that I think they are growing more and more national. I do not think the abyss is being bridged by cosmopolitan theories, and I am sure I do not want it bridged by all this slang journalism and blatant advertisement. I have called all that commercial publicity the gigantic shadow of America. It may be the shadow of America, but it is not the light of America. The light lies far beyond, a level light upon the lands of sunset, where it shines upon wide places full of a very simple and a very happy people, and those who would see it must seek for it. The end of chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 26, Chapter 14. Lincoln and Lost Causes. It has already been remarked here that the English know a great deal about past American literature, but nothing about past American history. They do not know either, of course, as well as they know the present American advertising, which is the least important of the three. But it is worth noting once more how little they know of the history, and how illogically that little is chosen. They have heard, no doubt, of the fame of the greatness of Henry Clay. He is a cigar. But it would be unwise to cross-examine any Englishman who may be consuming that luxury at the moment about the Missouri Compromise or the controversies with Andrew Jackson. And just as the statesman of Kentucky is a cigar, so the state of Virginia is a cigarette. But there is perhaps one exception, or half-exception, to this simple plan. It would perhaps be an exaggeration to say that Plymouth Rock is a chicken. Any English person keeping chickens, and chiefly interested in Plymouth Rocks, considered as chickens, would nevertheless have a hazy sensation of having seen the word somewhere before. He would feel subconsciously that the Plymouth Rock had not always been a chicken. Indeed, the name connotes something not only solid but antiquated, and is not therefore a very tactful name for a chicken. There would rise up before him something memorial in the haze that he calls his history, and he would see the history books of his boyhood and old engravings of men in steeple-crowned hats struggling with sea waves or Red Indians. The whole thing would suddenly become clear to him if, by a simple reform, the chickens were called Pilgrim Fathers. Then he would remember all about it. The Pilgrim Fathers were champions of religious liberty, and they discovered America. It is true that he has also heard of a man called Christopher Columbus, but that was in connection with an egg. He has also heard of somebody known as Sir Walter Raleigh, and though his principal possession was a cloak, it is also true that he had a potato, not to mention a pipe of tobacco. Can it be possible that he brought it from Virginia, where the cigarettes come from? Gradually the memories will come back and fit themselves together for the average henwife who learnt history at the English elementary schools, and who has now something better to do. Even when the narrative becomes consecutive, it will not necessarily become correct. It is not strictly true to say that the Pilgrim Fathers discovered America, but it is quite as true as saying that they were champions of religious liberty. If we said that they were martyrs who would have died heroically in torments rather than tolerate any religious liberty, we should be talking something like sense about them, and telling the real truth that is their due. The whole Puritan movement, from the Solemn League and Covenant to the last stand of the last Stuarts, was a struggle against religious toleration, or what they would have called religious indifference. The first religious equality on earth was established by a Catholic cavalier in Maryland. Now there is nothing in this to diminish any dignity that belongs to any real virtues and virilities in the Pilgrim Fathers. On the contrary, it is rather to the credit of their consistency and conviction. But there is no doubt that the note of their whole experiment in New England was intolerance and even inquisition. And there is no doubt that New England was then only the newest and not the oldest of these colonial experiments. At least two Cavaliers had been in the field before any Puritans, and they had carried with them much more of the atmosphere and nature of the normal Englishman than any Puritan could possibly carry. They had established it especially in Virginia, which had been founded by a great Elizabethan and named after the great Elizabeth. Before there was any New England in the north, there was something like very old England in the south. Relatively speaking, there still is. Whenever the anniversary of the Mayflower comes round, there is a chorus of Anglo-American congratulations and comradeship, as if this at least were a matter on which all can agree. But I knew enough about America, even before I went there, to know that there are a good many people there, at any rate, who do not agree with it. Long ago I wrote a protest in which I asked why Englishmen had forgotten the great state of Virginia, the first in foundation and long the first in leadership, and why a few crabbed nonconformists should have the right to erase a record that begins with Raleigh and ends with Lee, and incidentally includes Washington. The great state of Virginia was the backbone of America until it was broken in the Civil War. From Virginia came the first great presidents and most of the fathers of the Republic. Its adherence to the Southern side in the war made it a great war, and for a long time a doubtful war. And in the leader of the Southern armies it produced what is perhaps the one modern figure that may come to shine like St. Louis in The Lost Battle, or Hector dying before holy Troy. Again, it is characteristic that while the modern English know nothing about Lee, they do know something about Lincoln, and nearly all that they know is wrong. They know nothing of his Southern connections, nothing of his considerable Southern sympathy, nothing of the meaning of his moderation in face of the problem of slavery, now lightly treated as self-evident. Above all, they know nothing about the respect in which Lincoln was quite un-English, was indeed the very reverse of English, and can be understood better if we think of him as a Frenchman, since it seems so hard for some of us to believe that he was an American. I mean his lust for logic for its own sake, and the way he kept mathematical truths in his mind like the fixed stars. He was so far from being a merely practical man, impatient of academic abstractions, that he reviewed and revelled in academic abstractions even when he could not apply them to practical life. He loved to repeat that slavery was intolerable while he tolerated it, and to prove that something ought to be done while it was impossible to do it. This was probably very bewildering to his brother politicians, for politicians always whitewash what they do not destroy. But for all that, this inconsistent consistency beat the politicians at their own game, and this abstracted logic proved the most practical of all. For when the chance did come to do something, there was no doubt about the thing to be done. The thunderbolt fell from the clear heights of heaven. It had not been tossed about and lost like a common missile in the marketplace. The matter is worth mentioning, because it has a moral for a much larger modern question. A wise man's attitudes towards industrial capitalism will be very like Lincoln's attitude towards slavery. That is, he will manage to endure capitalism, but he will not endure a defence of capitalism. He will recognize the value, not only of knowing what he is doing, but of knowing what he would like to do. He will recognize the importance of having a thing clearly labelled in his own mind as bad, long before the opportunity comes to abolish it. He may recognize the risk of even worse things in immediate abolition, as Lincoln did in abolitionism. He will not call all businessmen brutes any more than Lincoln would call all planters demons, because he knows they are not. He will regard many alternatives to capitalism as crude and inhuman, as Lincoln regarded John Brown's raid, because they are. But he will clear his mind from cant about capitalism. He will have no doubt of what is the truth about trusts and trade combines and the concentration of capital. And it is the truth that they endure under one of the ironic silences of heaven, over the pageants and the passing triumphs of hell. But the name of Lincoln has a more immediate reference to the international matters I am considering here. His name has been much invoked by English politicians and journalists in connection with the quarrel with Ireland. And if we study the matter, we shall hardly admire the tact and sagacity of those journalists and politicians. History is an eternal tangle of cross purposes, and we could not take a clearer case, or rather a more complicated case, of such a tangle than the facts lying behind a political parallel recently mentioned by many politicians. I mean the parallel between the movement for Irish independence and the attempted secession of the Southern Confederacy in America. Superficially, anyone might say that the comparison is natural enough, and that there is much in common between the quarrel of the North and South in Ireland and the quarrel of the North and South in America. In both cases the South was on the whole agricultural, the North on the whole industrial. True, the parallel exaggerates the position of Belfast. To complete it, we must suppose the whole federal system to have consisted of Pittsburgh. In both, the side that was more successful was felt by many to be less attractive. In both, the same political terms were used, such as the term union and unionism. An ordinary Englishman comes to America knowing these main lines of American history, and knowing that the American knows the similar main lines of Irish history. He knows that there are strong champions of Ireland in America. Possibly he also knows that there are very genuine champions of England in America. By every possible historical analogy, he would naturally expect to find the pro-Irish in the South and the pro-English in the North. As a matter of fact, he finds almost exactly the opposite. He finds Boston governed by Irishmen, and Nashville containing the people more pro-English than Englishmen. He finds Virginians not only of British blood like George Washington, but of British opinions almost worthy of George III. But I do not say this, as will be seen in a moment, as a criticism of the comparative Toryism of the South. I say it as a criticism of the superlative stupidity of English propaganda. On another page I remark on the need for a new sort of English propaganda, a propaganda that should be really English and have some remote reference to England. Now, if it were a matter of making foreigners feel the real humours and humanities of England, there are no Americans so able or willing to do it as the Americans of the Southern States. As I have already hinted, some of them are so loyal to the English humanities that they think it is their duty to defend even the English inhumanities. New England is turning into New Ireland, but Old England can still be faintly traced in Old Dixie. It contains some of the best that England herself has had, and therefore, of course, the things that England herself has lost, or is trying to lose. But above all, as I have said, there are people in these places whose historic memories and family traditions really hold them to us, not by alliance, but by affection. Indeed, they have the affection in spite of the alliance. They love us in spite of our compliments and courtesies and hands across the sea. All our ambassadorial salutations and speeches cannot kill their love. They manage even to respect us in spite of the shady Jew stockbrokers we send them as English envoys, or the efficient men who are sent out to be tactful with foreigners because they have been too tactless with trades unionists. The type of traditional Americans, North or South, really has some traditions connecting him with England. And though he is now in a very small minority, I cannot imagine why England should wish to make it smaller. England once sympathized with the South still sympathizes with England. It would seem that the South, or some elements in the South, had rather the advantage of us in political firmness and fidelity. But it does not follow that the fidelity will stand every shock. And at this moment and in this matter, of all things in the world, our political propagandists must try to bolster British imperialism up by kicking Southern secession when it is down. The English politician eagerly points out that we shall be justified in crushing Ireland, exactly as Sumner and Stevens crushed the most English part of America. It does not seem to occur to them that this comparison between the Unionist triumph in America and a Unionist triumph in Britain is rather hard upon our particular sympathizers who did not triumph. When England exults in Lincoln's victory over his foes, she is exulting in his victory over her own friends. Or if her diplomacy continues as delicate and chivalrous as it is at present, they may soon be her only friends. But however this may be, it is as well to bear witness to some of the elements of my own experience, and I can answer for it at least that there are some people in the South who will not be pleased at being swept into the rubbish heap of history as rebels and ruffians, and who will not, I regret to say, by any means enjoy even being classed with Fenians and Sinn Feiners. Now, touching the actual comparison between the conquest of the Confederacy and the conquest of Ireland, there are, of course, a good many things to be said which politicians cannot be expected to understand. Strange to say, it is not certain that a lost cause was never worth winning, and it would be easy to argue that the world lost very much indeed when that particular cause was lost. These are not days in which it is exactly obvious that an agricultural society was more dangerous than an industrial one. And even Southern slavery has had this one moral merit, that it was decadent. It has this one historic advantage, that it is dead. The Northern slavery, industrial slavery, or what is called wage slavery, is not decaying, but increasing, and the end of it is not yet. But in any case, it would be well for us to realize that the reproach of resembling the Confederacy does not ring in all ears as an unanswerable condemnation. It is scarcely a self-evident or sufficient argument to some hearers even to prove that the English are as delicate and philanthropic as Sherman, still less that the Irish are as criminal and lawless as Lee. Nor will it soothe every single soul on the American continent to say that the English victory in Ireland will be followed by a reconstruction, like the reconstruction exhibited in the film called The Birth of a Nation. And indeed there is a further inference from that fine panorama of the exploits of the Ku Klux Klan. It would be easy, as I say, to turn the argument entirely in favour of the Confederacy. It would be easy to draw the moral, not that the Southern Irish are as wrong as the Southern States, but that the Southern States were as right as the Southern Irish. But upon the whole, I do not incline to accept the parallel in that sense any more than in the opposite sense. For reasons I have already given elsewhere, I do believe that in the main Abraham Lincoln was right. But right in what? If Lincoln was right, he was right in guessing that there was not really a Northern nation and a Southern nation, but only one American nation. And if he has been proved right, he has been proved right by the fact that men in the South, as well as the North, do now feel a patriotism for that American nation. His wisdom, if it really was wisdom, was justified not by his opponents being conquered, but by their being converted. Now, if the English politicians must insist on this parallel, they ought to see that the parallel is fatal to themselves. The very test which proved Lincoln right has proved them wrong. The very judgment which may have justified him quite unquestionably condemns them. We have again and again conquered Ireland, and have never come an inch nearer to converting Ireland. We have had not one Gettysburg, but 20 Gettysburgs. But we have had no Union. And that is where, as I have remarked, it is relevant to remember that flying fantastic vision on the films that told so many people what no histories have told them. I heard, when I was in America, rumours of the local reappearance of the Ku Klux Klan. But the smallness and mildness of the manifestation, as compared with the old Southern or the new Irish case, is alone a sufficient example of the exception that proves the rule. To approximate to any resemblance to recent Irish events, we must imagine the Ku Klux Klan riding again in more than the terrors of that vision, wild as the wind, white as the moon, terrible as an army with banners. If there were really such a revival of the Southern action, there would equally be a revival of the Southern argument. It would be clear that Lee was right and Lincoln was wrong, that the Southern States were national and were as indestructible as nations. If the South were as rebellious as Ireland, the North would be as wrong as England. But I desire a new English diplomacy that will exhibit not the things in which England is wrong, but the things in which England is right. And England is right in England, just as she is wrong in Ireland. And it is exactly that rightness of a real nation in itself that is at once most difficult and most desirable to explain to foreigners. Now the Irishman, and to some extent the American, has remained alien to England, largely because he does not truly realize that the Englishman loves England. Still less can he really imagine why the Englishman loves England. That is why I insist on the stupidity of ignoring and insulting the opinions of those few Virginians and other Southerners who really have some inherited notion of why Englishmen love England, and even love it in something of the same fashion themselves. Politicians who do not know the English spirit when they see it at home cannot, of course, be expected to recognize it abroad. Publicists are eloquently praising Abraham Lincoln for all the wrong reasons, but fundamentally for that worst and vilest of all reasons, that he succeeded. None of them seems to have the least notion of how to look for England in England, and they would see something fantastic in the figure of a traveller who found it elsewhere, or anywhere but in New England. And it is well, perhaps, that they have not yet found England where it is hidden in England, for if they found it, they would kill it. All I am concerned to consider here is the inevitable failure of this sort of Anglo-American propaganda to create a friendship. To praise Lincoln as an Englishman is about as appropriate as if we were praising Lincoln as an English town. We are talking about something totally different. And indeed the whole conversation is rather like some such cross purposes about some such word as Lincoln, in which one party should be talking about the President and the other about the cathedral. It is like some wild bewilderment in a farce, with one man wondering how a president could have a church spire and the other wondering how a church could have a chin beard. And the moral is the moral on which I would insist everywhere in this book, that the remedy is to be found in disentangling the two, and not in entangling them further. You could not produce a democrat of the logical type of Lincoln, merely out of the moral materials that now made up an English cathedral town, like that on which old Tom of Lincoln looks down. But on the other hand, it is quite certain that 100 Abraham Lincolns working for 100 years could not build Lincoln Cathedral. And the farcical allegory of an attempt to make old Tom and old Abe embrace to the glory of the illogical Anglo-Saxon language is but a symbol of something that is always being attempted, and always attempted in vain. It is not by mutual imitation that the understanding can come. It is not by erecting New York skyscrapers in London that New York can learn the sacred significance of the towers of Lincoln. It is not by English dukes importing the daughters of American millionaires that England can get any glimpse of the democratic dignity of American men. I have the best of all reasons for knowing that a stranger can be welcomed in America, and just as he is courteously treated in the country as a stranger, so he should always be careful to treat it as a strange land. That sort of imaginative respect, as for something different and even distant, is the only beginning of any attachment between patriotic peoples. The English traveller may carry with him at least one word of his own great language and literature, and whenever he is inclined to say of anything, "This is passing strange," he may remember that it was no inconsiderable Englishman who appended to it the answer, "And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome." The end of chapter 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 27, Chapter 15, Part 1, Wells and the World State. There was recently a highly distinguished gathering to celebrate the past, present, and especially future triumphs of aviation. Some of the most brilliant men of the age, such as Mr. H. G. Wells and Mr. J. L. Garvin, made interesting and important speeches, and many scientific aviators luminously discussed the new science. Among their graceful felicitations and grave and quiet analyses, a word was said or a note was struck which I myself can never hear, even in the most harmless after-dinner speech, without an impulse to leap up and yell, and smash the decanters, and wreck the dinner table. Long ago, when I was a boy, I heard it with fury, and never since have I been able to understand any free man hearing it without fury. I heard it when Bloch and the old prophets of pacifism by panic preached that war would become too horrible for patriots to endure. It sounded to me like saying that an instrument of torture was being prepared by my dentist that would finally cure me of loving my dog. And I felt it again when all these wise and well-meaning persons began to talk about the inevitable effect of aviation in bridging the Atlantic and establishing alliance and affection between England and America. I resent the suggestion that a machine can make me bad, but I resent quite equally the suggestion that a machine can make me good. It might be the unfortunate fact that a coolness had arisen between myself and Mr. Fitzarlington Blenkinsop, inhabiting the suburban villa and garden next to mine, and I might even be largely to blame for it. But if somebody told me that a new kind of lawn-mower had just been invented, of so cunning a structure that I should be forced to become a bosom friend of Mr. Blenkinsop, whether I liked it or not, I should be very much annoyed. I should be moved to say that if that was the only way of cutting my grass, I would not cut my grass, but continue to cut my neighbour. Or suppose the difference were even less defensible. Suppose a man had suffered from a trifling shindy with his wife, and suppose somebody told him that the introduction of an entirely new vacuum cleaner would compel him to a reluctant reconciliation with his wife. It would be found, I fancy, that human nature abhors that vacuum. Reasonably spirited human beings will not be ordered about by bicycles and sewing machines, and a sane man will not be made good, let alone bad, by the things he has himself made. I have occasionally dictated to a typewriter, but I will not be dictated to by a typewriter, even of the newest and most complicated mechanism. Nor have I ever met a typewriter, however complex, that attempted such a tyranny. Yet this and nothing else is what is implied in all such talk of the airplane annihilating distinctions as well as distances, and an international aviation abolishing nationalities. This and nothing else was really implied in one speaker's prediction that such aviation will almost necessitate an Anglo-American friendship. Incidentally, I may remark, it is not a true suggestion even in the practical and materialistic sense, and the speaker's phrase refuted the speaker's argument. He said that international relations must be more friendly when men can get from England to America in a day. Well, men can already get from England to Germany in a day, and the result was a mutual invitation of which the formalities lasted for 5 years. Men could get from the coast of England to the coast of France very quickly, through nearly all the ages during which those two coasts were bristling with arms against each other. They could get there very quickly when Nelson went down by that Burford Inn to embark for Trafalgar. They could get there very quickly when Napoleon sat in his tent in that camp at Boulogne that filled England with alarms of invasion. Are these the amiable and pacific relations which will unite England and America, when Englishmen can get to America in a day? The shortening of the distance seems quite as likely, so far as that argument goes, to facilitate that endless guerrilla warfare which raged across the narrow seas in the Middle Ages, when French invaders carried away the bells of Rye, and the men of those flats of East Sussex gloriously pursued and recovered them. I do not know whether American privateers landing at Liverpool would carry away a few of the more elegant factory chimneys as a substitute for the superstitious symbols of the past. I know not if the English on ripe reflection would essay with any enthusiasm to get them back. But anyhow, it is anything but self-evident that people cannot fight each other because they are near to each other. And if it were true, there would never have been any such thing as a border warfare in the world. As a fact, border warfare has often been the one sort of warfare which it was most difficult to bring under control. And our own traditional position in face of this new logic is somewhat disconcerting. We have always supposed ourselves safer because we were insular and therefore isolated. We have been congratulating ourselves for centuries on having enjoyed peace because we were cut off from our neighbours. And now they are telling us that we shall only enjoy peace when we are joined up with our neighbours. We have pitied the poor nations with frontiers, because a frontier only produces fighting. And now we are trusting to a frontier as the only thing that will produce friendship. But as a matter of fact, and for a far deeper and more spiritual reason, a frontier will not produce friendship. Only friendliness produces friendship. And we must look far deeper into the soul of man for the thing that produces friendliness. But apart from this fallacy about the facts, I feel, as I say, a strong abstract anger against the idea, or what some would call the ideal. If it were true that men could be taught and tamed by machines, even if they were taught wisdom or tamed to amiability, I should think it the most tragic truth in the world. A man so improved would be, in an exceedingly ugly sense, losing his soul to save it. But in truth he cannot be so completely coerced into good, and in so far as he is incompletely coerced, he is quite as likely to be coerced into evil. Of the financial characters who figure as philanthropists and philosophers in such cases, it is strictly true to say that their good is evil. The light in their bodies is darkness, and the highest objects of such men are the lowest objects of ordinary men. Their peace is mere safety, their friendship is mere trade, their international friendship is mere international trade. The best we can say of that school of capitalism is that it will be unsuccessful. It has every other vice, but it is not practical. It has at least the impossibility of idealism. And so far as remoteness can carry it, that inferno is indeed a utopia. All the visible manifestations of these men are materialistic, but at least their visions will not materialize. The worst we suffer, but the best we shall at any rate escape. We may continue to endure the realities of a cosmopolitan capitalism, but we shall be spared its ideals. But I am not primarily interested in the plutocrats whose vision takes so vulgar a form. I am interested in the same thing when it takes a far more subtle form in men of genius and genuine social enthusiasm like Mr. H.G. Wells. It would be very unfair to a man like Mr. Wells to suggest that in his vision the Englishman and the American are to embrace only in the sense of clinging to each other in terror. He is a man who understands what friendship is, and who knows how to enjoy the motley humours of humanity. But the political reconstruction which he proposes is too much determined by this old nightmare of necessitarianism. He tells us that our national dignities and differences must be melted into the huge mould of a world state, or else, and I think these are almost his own words, we shall be destroyed by the instruments and machinery we have ourselves made. In effect, men must abandon patriotism, or they will be murdered by science. After this, surely no one can accuse Mr. Wells of an undue tenderness for scientific over other types of training. Greek may be a good thing or no, but nobody says that if Greek scholarship is carried past a certain point, everybody will be torn in pieces like Orpheus, or burnt up like Semele, or poisoned like Socrates. Philosophy, theology, and logic may or may not be idle academic studies, but nobody supposes that the study of philosophy, or even of theology, ultimately forces its students to manufacture racks and thumbscrews against their will. or that even logicians need be so alarmingly logical as all that. Science seems to be the only branch of study in which people have to be waved back from perfection as from pestilence. But my business is not with the scientific dangers which alarm Mr. Wells, but with the remedy he proposes for them, or rather with the relationship of that remedy to foundation and future of America. Now, it is not too much to say that Mr. Wells finds his model in America. The world state is to be the United States of the world. He answers almost all objections to the practicability of such a peace among states by pointing out that the American states have such a peace, and by adding truly enough that another turn of history might easily have seen them broken up by war. The pattern of the world state is to be found in the New World. Oddly enough, as it seems to me, he proposes almost cosmic conquests for the American Constitution, while leaving out the most successful thing in that Constitution. The point appeared in answer to a question which many like myself must have put in this matter, the question of despotism and democracy. I cannot understand any democrat not seeing the danger of so distant and indirect a system of government. It is hard enough anywhere to get representatives to represent. It is hard enough to get a little town council to fulfil the wishes of a little town, even when the townsmen meet the town councillors every day in the street, and could kick them down the street if they liked. What the same town councillors would be like if they were ruling all their fellow creatures from the North Pole or the New Jerusalem is a vision of Oriental despotism beyond the towering fancies of Tamburlaine. This difficulty in all representative government is felt everywhere, and not least in America. But I think that if there is one truth apparent in such a choice of evils, it is that monarchy is at least better than oligarchy, and that where we have to act on a large scale, the most genuine popularity can gather round a particular person, like a pope or a president of the United States, or even a dictator like Caesar or Napoleon, rather than around a more or less corrupt committee which can only be defined as an obscure oligarchy. And in that sense any oligarchy is obscure. For people to continue to trust 27 men, it is necessary, as a preliminary formality, that people should have heard of them. And there are no 27 men of whom everybody has heard, as everybody in France has heard of Napoleon, and as all Catholics have heard of the Pope, or all Americans have heard of the President. I think the mass of ordinary Americans do really elect their President, and even where they cannot control him, at least they watch him, and in the long run they judge him. I think, therefore, that the American Constitution has a real popular institution in the presidency. But Mr. Wells would appear to want the American Constitution without the presidency. If I understand his words rightly, he seems to want the great democracy without its popular institution. Alluding to this danger that the world state might be a world tyranny, he seems to take tyranny entirely in the sense of autocracy. He asks whether the president of the world state would not be rather too tremendous a person, and seems to suggest in answer that there need not even be any such person. He seems to imply that the committee controlling the planet could meet almost without anyone in the chair, certainly without anyone on the throne. I cannot imagine anything more manifestly made to be a tyranny than such an acephalous aristocracy. But while Mr. Wells' decision seems to me strange, his reason for it seems to me still more extraordinary. He suggests that no such dictator will be needed in his world state because there will be no wars and no diplomacy. A world state ought doubtless to go round the world, and going round the world seems to be a good training for arguing in a circle. Obviously there will be no wars and no war diplomacy if something has the power to prevent them, and we cannot deduce that the something will not want any power. It is rather as if somebody, urging that the Germans could only be defeated by uniting the Allied commands under Marshal Foch, had said that after all it need not offend the British generals, because the French supremacy need only be a fiction, the Germans being defeated. We should naturally say that the German defeat would only be a reality because the Allied command was not a fiction. So the universal peace would only be a reality if the world state were not a fiction, and it could not even be a state if it were not a government. This argument amounts to saying first that the world state will be needed because it is strong, and then that it may safely be weak because it will not be needed. Internationalism is in any case hostile to democracy. I do not say it is incompatible with it, but any combination of the two will be a compromise between the two. The only purely popular government is local and founded on local knowledge. The citizens can rule the city because they know the city, but it will always be an exceptional sort of citizen who has or claims the right to rule over 10 cities, and these remote and altogether alien cities. All Irishmen may know roughly the same sort of things about Ireland, but it is absurd to say they all know the same things about Iceland, when they may include a scholar steeped in Icelandic sagas or a sailor who has been to Iceland. To make all politics cosmopolitan is to create an aristocracy of globe-trotters. If your particular outlook really takes in the Cannibal Islands, you depend of necessity upon a superior and picked minority of the people who have been to the Cannibal Islands, or rather of the still smaller and more select minority who have come back. The end of section 27. The end of part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 28, Chapter 15, Part 2, Wells and the World State. Given this difficulty about quite direct democracy over large areas, I think the nearest thing to democracy is despotism. At any rate, I think it is some sort of more or less independent monarchy, such as Andrew Jackson created in America. And I believe it is true to say that the two men whom the modern world really and almost reluctantly regards with impersonal respect, as clothed by their office with something historic and honourable, are the Pope and the President of the United States. But to admire the United States as the United States is one thing. To admire them as the world state is quite another. The attempt of Mr. Wells to make America a sort of model for the federation of all the free nations of the earth, though it is international in intention, is really as narrowly national in the bad sense as the desire of Mr. Kipling to cover the world with British imperialism, or of Professor Treitschke to cover it with Prussian pan-Germanism. Not being schoolboys, we no longer believe it can be done by painting it blue with white spots, even if they are called stars. The insufficiency of British imperialism does not lie in the fact that it has always been applied by force of arms. As a matter of fact, it has not. It has been effected largely by commerce, by colonization of comparatively empty places, by geographical discovery and diplomatic bargain. Whether it can be regarded as praise or blame, it is certainly the truth that among all the things that have called themselves empires, the British has been perhaps the least purely military, and has least both of the special guilt and the special glory that goes with militarism. The insufficiency of British imperialism is not that it is imperial, let alone military. The insufficiency of British imperialism is that it is British, when it is not merely Jewish. It is that just as a man is no more than a man, so a nation is no more than a nation, and any nation is inadequate as an international model. Any state looks small when it occupies the whole earth. Any polity is narrow as soon as it is wide as the world. It would be just the same if Ireland began to paint the map green or Montenegro were to paint it black. The objection to spreading anything all over the world is that, among other things, you have to spread it very thin. But America, which Mr. Wells takes as a model, is in another sense rather a warning. Mr. Wells says very truly that there was a moment in history when America might well have broken up into independent states like those of Europe. He seemed to take it for granted that it was in all respects an advantage that this was avoided. Yet there is surely a case, however mildly we put it, for a certain importance in the world still attaching to Europe. There are some who find France as interesting as Florida, and who think they can learn as much about history and humanity in the marble cities of the Mediterranean as in the wooden towns of the Middle West. Europe may have been divided, but it was certainly not destroyed. Nor has its peculiar position in the culture of the world been destroyed. Nothing has yet appeared capable of completely eclipsing it, either in its extension in America or its imitation in Japan. But the immediate point here is perhaps a more important one. There is now no creed accepted as embodying the common sense of all Europe, as the Catholic creed was accepted as embodying it in medieval times. There is no culture broadly superior to all the others, as the Mediterranean culture was superior to that of the barbarians in Roman times. If Europe were united in modern times, it would probably be by the victory of one of its types over others, possibly over all the others. And when America was united finally in the 19th century, it was taken by the victory of one of its types over others. It is not yet certain that this victory was a good thing. It is not yet certain that the world will be better for the triumph of the North over the South traditions of America. It may yet turn out to be as unfortunate as a triumph of the North Germans over the Southern traditions of Germany and of Europe. The men who will not face this fact are men whose minds are not free. They are more crushed by progress than by any pietists by Providence. They are not allowed to question that whatever has recently happened was all for the best. Now progress is Providence without God. That is, it is a theory that everything has always perpetually gone right by accident. It is a sort of atheistic optimism, based on an everlasting coincidence far more miraculous than a miracle. If there be no purpose, or if the purpose permits of human free will, then in either case it is almost insanely unlikely that there should be in history a period of steady and uninterrupted progress, or in other words a period in which poor bewildered humanity moves amid a chaos of complications without making a single mistake. What has to be hammered into the heads of most normal newspaper readers today is that man has made a great many mistakes. Modern man has made a great many mistakes. Indeed, in the case of that progressive and pioneering character, one is sometimes tempted to say that he has made nothing but mistakes. Calvinism was a mistake, and capitalism was a mistake, and Teutonism and the flattery of the northern tribes were mistakes. In the French, the persecution of Catholicism by the politicians was a mistake, as they found out in the Great War, when the memory gave Irish or Italian Catholics an excuse for hanging back. In England, the loss of agriculture and therefore of food supply in war, and the power to stand a siege, was a mistake. And in America the introduction of the Negro slaves was a mistake. But it may yet be found that the sacrifice of the Southern white man to them was even more of a mistake. The reason of this doubt is in one word. We have not yet seen the end of the whole industrial experiment, and there are already signs of it coming to a bad end. It may end in Bolshevism. It is more likely to end in the Servile State. Indeed, the two things are not so different as some suppose, and they grow less different every day. The Bolshevists have already called in capitalists to help them crush the free peasants. The capitalists are quite likely to call in labour leaders to whitewash their compromise as social reform or even socialism. The cosmopolitan Jews, who are the communists in the East, will not find it so very hard to make a bargain with the cosmopolitan Jews who are capitalists in the West. The Western Jews would be willing to admit a nominal socialism. The Eastern Jews have already admitted that their socialism is nominal. It was the Bolshevist leader himself who said, "Russia is again a capitalist country." But whoever makes the bargain, and whatever is its precise character, the substance of it will be servile. It will be servile in the only rational and reliable sense, that is, an arrangement by which a mass of men are ensured shelter and livelihood in return for being subjected to a law which obliges them to continue to labour. Of course it will not be called the Servile State. It is very probable that it will be called the Socialist State. But nobody seems to realize how very near all the industrial countries are to it. At any moment it may appear in the simple form of compulsory arbitration. For compulsory arbitration dealing with private employers is by definition slavery. When workmen receive unemployment pay and at the same time arouse more and more irritation by going on strike, it may seem very natural to give them the unemployment pay for good and forbid them the strike for good, and the combination of those two things is by definition slavery. And Trotsky can beat any trust magnate as a strikebreaker, for he does not even pretend that his compulsory labour is a free bargain. If Trotsky and the trust magnate come to a working compromise, that compromise will be a servile state. But it will also be the supreme and by far the most constructive and conclusive result of the industrial movement in history, of the power of machinery or money, of the huge populations of the modern cities, of scientific inventions and resources, of all the things before which the agricultural society of the Southern Confederacy went down. But even those who cannot see that commercialism may end in the triumph of slavery can see that the Northern victory has to a great extent ended in the triumph of commercialism. And the point at the moment is that this did definitely mean, even at the time, the triumph of one American type over another American type, just as much as any European war might mean the triumph of one European type over another. A victory of England over France would be a victory of merchants over peasants, and the victory of Northerners over Southerners was a victory of merchants over squires, so that the very unity which Mr. Wells contrasts so favourably with war was not only itself due to a war, but to a war which had one of the most questionable and even perilous of the results of war. That result was a change in the balance of power, the predominance of a particular partner, the exaltation of a particular example, the eclipse of excellent traditions when the defeated lost their international influence. In short, it made exactly the same sort of difference of which we speak when we say that 1870 was a disaster to Europe, or that it was necessary to fight Prussia lest she should Prussianize the whole world. America would have been very different if the leadership had remained with Virginia. The world would have been very different if America had been very different. It is quite reasonable to rejoice that the issue went as it did. Indeed, as I have explained elsewhere, for other reasons, I do on the whole rejoice in it. But it is certainly not self-evident that it is a matter for rejoicing. One type of American state conquered and subjugated another type of American state, and the virtues and values of the latter were very largely lost to the world. So if Mr. Wells insists on the parallel of a United States of Europe, he must accept the parallel of a civil war of Europe. He must suppose that the peasant countries crush the industrial countries, or vice versa, and that one or the other of them becomes the European tradition, to the neglect of the other. The situation which seems to satisfy him so completely in America is, after all, the situation which would result in Europe if the Germanic empires, let us say, had entirely arrested the special development of the Slavs, or if the influence of France had really broken off short under a blow from Britain. The Old South had qualities of humane civilization which have not sufficiently survived, or at any rate have not sufficiently spread. It is true that the decline of the agricultural South has been considerably balanced by the growth of the agricultural West. It is true, as I have occasion to emphasize in another place, that the West does give the new America something that is nearly a normal peasantry, as a pendant to the industrial towns. But this is not an answer. It is rather an augmentation of the argument. In so far as America is saved, it is saved by being patchy, and would be ruined if the Western patch had the same fate as the Southern patch. When all is said, therefore, the advantages of American unification are not so certain that we can apply them to a world unification. The doubt could be expressed in a great many ways, and by a great many examples. For that matter, it is already being felt that the supremacy of the Middle West in politics is inflicting upon other localities exactly the sort of local injustice that turns provinces into nations struggling to be free. It has already inflicted what amounts to religious persecution, or the imposition of an alien morality, on the wine-growing civilization of California. In a word, the American system is a good one as governments go, but it is too large, and the world will not be improved by making it larger. And for this reason alone, I should reject this second method of uniting England and America, which is not only Americanizing England, but Americanizing everything else. But the essential reason is that a type of culture came out on top in America and England in the 19th century, which cannot and would not be tolerated on top of the world. To unite all the systems at the top without improving and simplifying their social organization below would be to tie all the tops of the trees together where they rise above a dense and poisonous jungle, and make the jungle darker than before. To create such a cosmopolitan political platform would be to build a roof above our own heads, to shut out the sunlight on which only usurers and conspirators, clad in gold, could walk about in the sun. This is no moment when industrial intellectualism can inflict such an artificial oppression upon the world. Industrialism itself is coming to see dark days, and its future is very doubtful. It is split from end to end with strikes and struggles for economic life, in which the poor not only plead that they are starving, but even the rich can only plead that they are bankrupt. The peasantries are growing not only more prosperous, but more politically effective. The Russian Moujik has held up the Bolshevist government of Moscow and Petersburg. A huge concession has been made by England to Ireland. The League of Nations has decided for Poland against Prussia. It is not certain that industrialism will not wither, even in its own field. It is certain that its intellectual ideas will not be allowed to cover every field, and this sort of cosmopolitan culture is one of its ideas. Industrialism itself may perish, or, on the other hand, industrialism itself may survive, by some searching and scientific reform that will really guarantee economic security to all. It may really purge itself of the accidental maladies of anarchy and famine, and continue as a machine. but at least as a comparatively clean and humanely shielded machine. At any rate, no longer as a man-eating machine. Capitalism may clear itself of its worst corruptions by such reform as is open to it, by creating humane and healthy conditions for labour, and setting the labouring class to work under a lucid and recognised law. It may make Pittsburgh one vast model factory for all who will model themselves upon factories, and may give to all men and women in its employment a clear social status in which they can be contented and secure. And on the day when that social security is established for the masses, when the industrial capitalism has achieved this larger and more logical organisation, and found peace at last, a strange and shadowy and ironic triumph, like an abstract apology, will surely hover over all those graves in the wilderness, where lay the bones of so many gallant gentlemen, men who had also from their youth known and upheld such a social stratification, who had the courage to call a spade and a slave a slave. The end of section 28, chapter 15.